All right. Well, hello, everyone. I hope it's a sunny day where y'all are at. So I know I've been eating the vitamin D. Thanks for joining us today for this quick 1 hour webinar on wildfires and utilities in the Northwest. We're happy to have you here, and let's jump into it. So we go to the next slide. We are the Northwest Energy Coalition. We're a coalition that advances clean, equitable, and affordable energy policies by leveraging our analytic expertise and convening a broad alliance of people and organizations. Feel free to visit our website for more information. And also wanted to take this opportunity to do a quick plug. We're excited to be kicking off the search of our new executive director since our beloved Nancy, our current executive director, will be leaving this summer. We're planning to open the opportunity to applicants in mid-April, and we will share it out with our members and on social media. We're also share it in our newsletter, which Kat could put a link in the chat to that so you could sign up and receive our newsletter. We really appreciate you thinking ahead about your network if there's someone you might want to refer, or if there's others in your network that you would want to share it with, because it's a really important transition for us, and we appreciate everyone's support during this process. And so for the next slide, we are on Zoom today. And so engaging with us on Zoom, be respectful of presenters and attendees, keep chat on topic and respectful, put questions in the chat for the Q&A section that we'll have at the end, and then also stay muted unless you're called upon. Since this is a 1 hour webinar, we are limiting open discussion and may not get to all the Q&A, but we'll do our best. And this will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel if folks want to go back to it. So quick introductions. My name is Alessandra de la Torre. I use she, her pronouns. I am a policy associate with the Northwest Energy Coalition, and I am based in Southern Oregon. And I'll pass it over to Samia.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Salmia Keefe. I'm a policy intern with the Northwest Energy Coalition and based in Seattle. And I'll pass it to Lauren.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren McCloy. I'm the Utility and Regulatory Director with Northwest Energy Coalition, and I'm based in North Central Washington.
Thanks, y'all. And also special thanks to Kat and Charlie and Jill on our team for tech support today. We can't do it without you. So today for our agenda, we'll be talking about planning and implementation of utility wildfire mitigation strategies. We'll go into some community impacts and solutions or considerations around preparedness, resiliency, and affordability. We'll do a quick overview of the 2025 legislative sessions that we're seeing in the 4 states, and then wrap up with ways to stay connected and a Q&A. And so before we get started, I want to make sure that we ground ourselves in our relationship with fire and the inevitable of living amongst it. Wildland fires occur naturally across North America and generally are considered beneficial to most ecosystems. Before European colonization, fire was used and is still used today by the indigenous peoples of these lands as a tool to support healthy forest. In the early 20th century, however, fire was suppressed in U.S. forest management, and now we have vegetation accumulation and non-native plant species, which are fueling these tremendous wildfires that we see today. This increase in fire risk due to the suppression of fire, human-caused climate change, building in the wildland-urban interface, and more has added pressures to legislators, advocates, forest and fire stewards, community members, utilities, public utility commissions at a really fast rate to do something about this. And though wildfire management and forest resiliency expand beyond utilities, utilities must be part of the solutions. Northwest Energy Coalition in particular is getting involved in this work as it relates to the utility system. So utility cost and benefits, investment decisions, community impacts and resiliency, and connecting those to other planning, other programs and investments as well. So these are all pieces that we're analyzing and discussing with partners, advocates, and professionals. Definitely a learning stage, but we are all in this together. So let's get started, and I'll pass it over to Samia.
Thank you. So we're going to start by going into the planning and implementation of utility wildfire mitigation plans and strategies. Next slide, please. So utility wildfire mitigation plans, what are they and how did they start? So as the frequency and intensity of wildfires has increased in this region in the Pacific Northwest, electric utilities have also at times been found to be the cause of some wildfires. So because of this, we have seen the introduction of utility wildfire mitigation plans across the region. So these plans are 100 plus pages and they outline high fire risk zones and mitigation strategies such as infrastructure upgrades, vegetation management, and power shutoffs that utilities are undertaking in these areas designated as high fire risk zones. It's also important to note that due to human-caused climate change, these zones are only growing, and the risk of wildfires are only increasing annually. So investor-owned utilities submit these plans to their Public Utility Commission, either annually or every few years, where the commission reviews and approves the plans. And some consumer-owned utilities are also submitting similar plans to their boards. As of right now, in Oregon and Washington, these plans are required for investor-owned utilities by state law. In Idaho and Montana, some utilities are already creating and submitting wildfire mitigation plans, but they're not yet required, although there is legislation in both of those states, so that could change here shortly. Next slide, please. So in these wildfire mitigation plans, there are some across utilities, there are some common strategies and investments that go into these. And so the first one is grid or system hardening, and this includes replacing aging overhead lines with fire-resistant infrastructure, installing advanced weather stations, and upgrading protective devices, as well as wrapping poles with fire-resistant wrap. Another large bucket is enhanced vegetation management. So this includes assessing and managing trees that are dangerously close to electric infrastructure. And this is something that's done across utility service territories. However, in high fire risk zones, it's done more often, typically annually. Asset inspections are another large area. And this refers to assessing the infrastructure, utility infrastructure, for a variety of possible risk factors, security concerns, and performance issues. Once again, this is something that utilities do across their service territory, but more often in high fire risk zones. And the fourth large area of investment is introducing the use of sensitive settings or enhanced fire settings. So these are settings that can be enabled in high fire risk zones when the weather is deemed high risk. And so that's takes into consideration factors such as wind speed and humidity. And when these settings are turned on, they reduce the amount of energy released during a fault and shut off circuits if any foreign objects come in contact with the infrastructure, such as vegetation or animals. And this is in order to limit sparks that could ignite fires in these areas. And the fifth large area is kind of twofold. The first being public safety power shutoffs, and the second being the unplanned de-energization of lines. So public safety power shutoffs are a last resort planned power shutoff when the weather is high risk. This takes into consideration, once again, factors such as humidity and high wind speed in a certain area. So when a public safety power shutoff is initiated, there are certain communication protocols that start, and for some utilities, public safety power shutoffs also trigger community resiliency resources, such as community resource centers. In contrast to this, when there is unplanned de-energization of lines, that occurs when lines are de-energized due to the enhanced safety settings I just mentioned. These power shutoffs are unplanned and there's little to no communication or resources available for affected customers. So these differences in communication between public safety power shutoffs and unplanned de-energization is something we'll get into a little bit more later on as well. And the sixth and final large area is increasing the staffing for situational awareness, system monitoring, outreach, and program operations. So this large bucket includes developing and running risk analysis models, weather monitoring, in some cases constructing weather stations, as well as the installing and monitoring remote smoke detectors in high fire risk zones. Next slide, please. So now to look at, of those 6 areas that I just mentioned, where utilities are investing the most heavily. And it's also, I just want to note that this is generalized across the Pacific Northwest region, across the 4 states that we've been looking at these plans in, but these are accurate across the states, generally as the main areas that utilities are investing in. So the top 4 spending areas are grid hardening, vegetation management, situational awareness, and asset inspection. And this is based on the utility wildfire mitigation plans, but it's also worth noting that these four areas, as well as the examples we're about to go into, do not include the cost of insurance and borrowing, which are also extremely expensive and costs that get passed on to ratepayers as well. And so these investments are all primarily in the utility's own infrastructure and assets, which is good and necessary. But as we'll get into a little bit more later, they need to be paired with investments in the community as well. Next slide, please. So this table is an example of Avista's overall wildfire resiliency program cost across both their Idaho and Washington service territory, and it was published in 2023. So this highlights the high investments that utilities such as Avista are making in their grid hardening and vegetation management specifically. As you can see here, the spending for vegetation management doubled from 2021 to 2022, going from around $6 to $15 million. Another area to note is that the spending for the operations and maintenance costs for grid hardening between 2021 and 2022 also just about doubled, going from 500,000 to 900,000. And so these increases highlight how utilities are focused on making specific investments in their own systems and infrastructure and transmission. Next slide, please. So we just looked at Avista's cost for Idaho and Washington. And so now I want to bring up this example, which is Pacific Power's costs for Oregon only. And this is from their 2024 utility wildfire mitigation plan. And things to highlight here are once again the high vegetation management cost. 19 million was spent in 2023, and the 5-year projected cost for vegetation management for Pacific Power in Oregon is 111 million. As well as it's worth noting that their grid hardening is projected to be 9 million over the next 5 years. And Pacific Power separates grid hardening from system hardening, but some utilities don't make that separation. Next slide, please. This is a continuation of that previous chart. Once again, Pacific Power's costs from their 2024 utility wildfire mitigation plan. And as you can see here as well, the system hardening cost is very large, almost 46 million in 2023, with a projected 765 million estimated over the next 5 years. And once again, that's in addition to the 9 million of grid hardening we saw on the previous slide. So as you can see, between just looking at the Vista and Pacific Power examples, the specific numbers vary across utilities and service territories based on their sizes and how much of each service territory is considered to be in high wildfire risk zones. So for example, in Oregon, Pacific Power has around 3,600 miles of transmission in high fire risk zones, while Portland General Electric only has around 1,000 miles of transmission in Oregon. And so because of that, the specific numbers and the costs for each utilities and in their plans are different. But what's important to see here is the relative costs between utilities to see what they're investing in, specifically how much utilities are investing in their infrastructure via system and grid hardening and vegetation management. Next slide, please. So we just talked about some really large numbers and what utilities are investing in, but what does that mean for ratepayers? And this is data for Oregon specifically, once again, and we pulled this from a presentation that the Oregon Public Utility Commission Executive Director made in September to the Oregon State Senate Energy and Environment Committee. And there he showed that monthly for Oregon electric customers, there's about $4 in each bill that goes into utility wildfire mitigation. And so that's just kind of an important number to keep in mind as we understand more and continue into this presentation of the impacts and solutions of what these plans mean for customers. And so now I'll pass it over to Ale to continue on into impacts and community solutions.
Thank you. Thank you, Samia. So these wildfire mitigation strategies, investments, and costs have impacts on communities, and we will not cover all of them and understand that solutions are nuanced and dependent on each community and utility. But here are some of the things that we have gathered so far on preparedness, resilience, and affordability. So as a wildfire mitigation strategy, as Samia noted, electric utilities across the region have activated these sensitive settings on their lines during fire season to automatically shut off when a fault is detected. This has increased the probability of unplanned outages, sometimes long duration outages, because crews need to go and re-energize the power lines themselves on the ground. And we know losing power has immediate and lasting impacts on people. That includes the loss of cooling and air filtration during a time of extreme heat and smoky skies. This is especially dangerous for kids, seniors, and people with certain health conditions or who rely on electricity for medical needs. People can experience food and medicine loss. Businesses are forced to close, and gas stations or water pumps stop working. The list really goes on and on about people's experiences with these unplanned outages. So we know that they have serious health, safety, and financial impacts on communities. People are also confronted with energy bills that are continuing to rise, yet their access to reliable, clean, and affordability is not. Community members have shared that they understand the need to shut off power to not ignite a fire and the need for utility infrastructure upgrades, but are really concerned about where the balance is for customer well-being, preparedness, and resilience, especially when customers are the ones beholden to pay into the system. There have been gaps in coordination and communication by utilities with important groups such as local governments, legislators, local forest management, community-based organizations, and community members. And also, public utility commissions and consumer utility boards are already stretched thin. The lack of capacity within these bodies is affecting on-the-ground analysis and in-depth, meaningful evaluation of these costly utility wildfire mitigation plans. It also it comes with new responsibilities associated with these plans or new legislation that's putting on new responsibilities on these bodies. And that doesn't also include consumer advocates who are also stretched thin with the amount of work to do and their ability to engage in these plans as they're hefty, large, and involve a variety of expertise. So we'll go into the next slide. Samia took us through some of the high cost drivers, and this isn't one of them, but it does bring up the important piece of utilities investing in community resilience. So very few of our regional utilities mention battery investments or programming in their plans, but here are some examples. Puget Sound Energy, through a third party, is initiating a remote grid systems feasibility analysis as a potential solution for wildfire mitigation. So these remote grid systems would serve customers with combination of solar, batteries, and generators when power lines are de-energized. These systems can be a more cost-effective alternative to undergrounding lines and provide added benefits to community members. Avista, in their plan, they briefly mention a no-cost battery backup program for medical certificate holders. We don't really have much more information on like data on that program. Portland General Electric also has a no-cost battery backup program for medical certificate holders within high fire risk zones. So far, 58% of eligible customers are enrolled, and Portland General Electric hopes to get 75% enrollment in 2025. They also have a well water research initiative to find out more about what kind of battery systems can support backup power for well and water pumps. And in Oregon, Pacific Power is now on year 2 of their battery rebate program for medical certificate holders. The enrollment rate among eligible individuals is a mere 1.6%. And Pacific Power announced in their 2025 Wildfire Mitigation Plan update that they would be reducing their participant goal for this year. Customers have shared that some of the barriers to access this rebate program are due to upfront costs that they would have to provide themselves. Pacific Power spent only $20,000 on this program last year and plans to budget $200,000 for the program this year. Some utilities are also establishing community resource centers in different locations that provide backup power, charging stations, and other services only during public safety power shutoffs. It is important to mention, though, that public safety power shutoffs don't occur as frequently as unplanned outages, especially with these sensitive settings during fire seasons. So we'll go now onto some community solutions, some things that we want to provide as consideration and things that we want to see utilities invest in and ensure that we're working on these things together for community. So wildfire investments need to go beyond utility infrastructure. Just across the board, utilities are not investing as heavily within the communities that they serve. To address the community impacts that we have outlined, utilities must invest in distributed energy resources and battery storage, microgrids, community-based renewable energy projects, as well as expanding transmission and investing in specific localized solutions that communities come up with, that they work on together, and that they're able to support. Utilities could also invest and support resilience hubs, which can work in tandem with their community resource centers. Utilities should aim to create no-cost battery backup programs and expand eligibility to other vulnerable groups, such as low-income households with young kids, seniors, and people on fixed incomes, as well as just other community-wide type of battery programs. Utilities need to advocate for, create legislation, and invest in the expansion of customer protections and programs that lower energy bills. So this could look like not disconnecting people in seasons that are too hot or too cold, not disconnecting people based on income level or other vulnerabilities. Also supporting or removing barriers for community solar, weatherization, energy efficiency, demand response, programs that we know have customer savings. And also creating and expanding utility discount programs and looking into, direct bill credits to compensate for shutoffs, to compensate for food loss and other loss that people experience during these shutoffs. And then lastly on this one, utility wildfire mitigation plans should include a section that details how utilities are addressing impacts and investing in solutions for customers and the environment. That would make it much easier for people reviewing the plans like ourselves and other advocates, and also for other people to know what kind of investments they're really looking into to mitigate some of these impacts that happen with these wildfire mitigation strategies. So this section can indicate that the cost of these approaches or projects are not in the wildfire budget specifically and are related to other planning, right, such as meeting clean energy targets or energy efficiency targets, things like that, yet directly tied to the effects of these wildfire mitigation strategies. So to continue on with some more community solutions, we also see that increasing public knowledge is crucial for preparedness. Most utilities conduct outreach every year on these plans through media, webinars, community meetings, and more. But communication methods in public education and emergency response need to be strengthened across the board. So utilities should build up strong communication protocols for unplanned outages, right? These de-energized outages that happen because of the safety settings. There are extensive and really thought out protocols for public safety power shutoffs, yet those are last resort and they're not really happening as often. So we really want to push that utilities improve their communication for these unplanned outages, how to do communications in a quicker turnaround. Utilities need to expand who they are in communication with and when. So more community serving groups should be added to the public safety partners list, which currently consists of emergency responders and hospitals, telecommunication providers, water agencies, among others. Yet also adding crucial local groups and institutions that could help get the word out in communities that should be identified and invited to be part of that communication chain. And reporting is also really imperative to know what is happening. We recommend that utilities share localized reports of wildfire mitigation plans and actions, as well as outage and shutoff information to maintain local governments and groups in the know of what's happening. And As we grounded in the beginning, fire is amongst us and we have to learn to live with it. We need to ensure measures utilities are investing in for wildfire mitigation are reducing the risk and the spread. But even more strongly at this point, that investments are also forward-looking um, and optimizing customer dollars to better withstand the impacts of fire on our energy system. And that's with also the hopes of reducing these wildfire mitigation costs in the long run. So having data collection, running cost benefit analysis will be important to understand risk reduction and what the best wildfire investments are. Gather scientific and ecological and other relevant expertise to analyze strategies, to coordinate, and to come up with long-term resilient solutions, especially in relation to those highest cost drivers, right, like vegetation management and grid hardening. We also must take seriously the proactive stewardship of this land. So talk to or contract botanists, other indigenous peoples who are working on fire resiliency programs to learn more about how to plant low growth native vegetation to reduce the amount of trimming and just explore what it means to work with fire and not just suppress it. Also invest in reducing risk for customers, such as fire hardening home programs to reduce spread and damage a fire may cause. This is in turn, when we think about insurance coverage, this can in turn help with some of those when you're reducing risk within communities. And insurance is such a huge issue that could be a whole other webinar. But thinking about these holistic approaches that we could all take. And public utility commissions, consumer utility boards need more funding and capacity to do this work and stronger enforcement mechanisms to keep utilities accountable, to not gold plate their system, and instead ensure investments create longstanding solutions that ultimately reduce costs, stabilize utilities, and bring the maximum community benefits. So we hope to see these solutions in utility plans being considered amongst commissions and boards, in rulemakings and in legislation, which really brings us to this last section of this webinar on the legislative session. So I'll pass it over to Lauren.
Thank you, Ale. So as the risk of catastrophic wildfires have increased and the damages grow, so does the need for policy to address the impacts on utilities and utility customers. And 2025 is a big year for utility wildfire legislation in our region, with efforts underway in all 4 states to address utility liability, mitigation planning, financial tools, and community impacts. So I'm going to give a high-level overview of some of the legislation that's currently under consideration. Next slide, please. We'll start first with Oregon. So in Oregon, there are 2 primary bills that are currently being considered by the legislature. The first is HB 3917, which is creates a wildfire fund with monies from public utilities, the state budget, gifts, grants, earnings, reimbursements from money paid to claimants. And it requires basically that the fund would cover 80% of property damages and includes non-economic damages up to a cap of $100,000. The capitalization of the fund would be paid half by utility shareholders and half from customers for the utility portion of the capitalization. And the bill limits the overall rate impact to 3% across all customer classes. There's a public hearing on the bill next week. We anticipate there's going to be a lot of interest in this bill, and we are actively engaging with our allies, both in the industry and amongst community groups on this bill. The second bill is HB 3666, which creates a process for wildfire safety certificates under the purview of the Public Utility Commission. And essentially what this would allow is for public utilities to apply for a safety certificate from their regulator, which they would basically be able to say, if approved, it demonstrates that they took reasonable actions to mitigate the risk of wildfire on their system, and did so consistent with their wildfire mitigation plan. This does have the benefit of potentially, reducing overall liability risk for utilities in the state, which could help mitigate overall cost on customers. However, we have heard some concerns, obviously keeping the utilities insured is very important, allowing them to access affordable insurance. But we have heard some concerns that public utility regulators don't feel that they have the right kind of expertise to be able to provide these sort of assurances. And we know that they're already strapped in terms of resources and capacity across the board. So we would definitely want to see some increased capacity and resources to the Oregon PUC, as well as other public utility commissions in the region who might be embarking on this new type of safety certificate process. Next slide. And in Washington, there are also a handful of bills. The first one would allow for utility companies to securitize certain costs related to disasters or emergencies, including wildfire. Lots of states have these kind of general emergency securitization statutes. Washington does not. And so this effectively extends, what is an existing financial tool for utilities to address, extreme events, and to be able to use securitization to basically access lower cost capital when they need to rebuild their systems in light of such an event. We have engaged with the sponsors on this bill. In general, we're supportive of securitization as a financial tool that can help balance affordability and reducing the risk to the utility over the long term. We do have a few concerns about some of the definitions in the bill, but in general would like to see something like this move ahead in Washington to help balance some of those risks and allow utilities to access securitization for these purposes going forward. HB 1522 is a bill that would require utilities in the state to develop wildfire mitigation plans, which are currently developed under state law, but this does sort of provide a little bit more structure to the process. It would include procedures and standards for vegetation management, public safety power shutoff, and other wildfire mitigation strategy guidance. We do support this bill. We do think a certain level of consistency in the state amongst utilities on how they're considering wildfire mitigation plans and wildfire mitigation actions is important. And this bill is a step in the right direction. Next slide, please. And moving east in Montana, there's also a wildfire bill, House Bill 490, which requires a wildfire mitigation plan and establishes a process by the PUC, as well as by the Board of Trustees or governing bodies for other types of utilities. It, for the first time, would require investor-owned utilities and consumer-owned utilities to submit wildfire mitigation plans. It also removes strict liability in the law so that utilities cannot be held strictly liable if they are found to be, if they are sued for results of a wildfire. It does include it does allow for utilities to cover economic damages and non-economic damages if the wildfire results in bodily injury or death associated with the utility's liability. And next slide. And in Idaho, there are two bills under consideration. Senate Bill 1183 requires the utilities to submit wildfire mitigation plans, which are currently not required. But this would also allow the commission to consult with the state forester to help review those plans in a way that gives the regulator a little bit more guidance from folks in the state with wildfire expertise. It also provides a means for the utility to avoid liability if they are found to have acted reasonably and in following the approved plan. It does preserve liability in cases of intentional or reckless acts that cause harm, which we think is an important consumer protection. It does leave a lot of room for, some utility plan specific arguments that maybe their plan is too weak or wasn't properly funded. And so that's why it's really important, I think, for the agencies to be well resourced in reviewing and approving these plans. It could be improved, we think, by giving the state forester a larger role. And then making sure that the PUC again has enough resources in its budget to access the expertise necessary to review the plan. And then lastly, HB 384, we included this on the list. It proposes a statewide wildfire insurance fund, which would be funded through tax dollars in the state and donations to help property owners in cases where their insurance does not cover all the damages. In general, this is I think just shows the increasing interest and increasing policy activity in this space. Since this one isn't directly related to utilities or utility ratepayers, we're not necessarily engaging in this bill, but wanted folks to be aware of it. And with that, I will pass it back to Ale.
Thank you, Lauren. All right, so if you all got questions, please put them in the chat. Just different ways to get involved and stay updated. So these wildfire mitigation plans that utilities submit usually have public comment periods. They're involved in, different dockets. So if you want to get engaged, feel free to, submit public comments. You could always reach out to Northwest Energy Coalition if you want more details of those exact utility docket numbers or anything like that. But we really believe that the more the merrier here is better. Like I said, we're in a learning stage with these plans. It's definitely kind of newer with the last few years that these have been developed, that the PUC, Public Utility Commissions and boards have developed processes and rulemakings. So being able to collect pockets of knowledge from all around and different expertise is going to be really helpful for this. So feel free to engage, reach out. You could also sign up for our newsletter as we, talk about wildfires and are able to update there. And also come to our conferences. We're going to have one in Missoula, Montana on May 7th. And we usually have a couple of these every year. And wildfires is a big topic right now, just in general and with utilities. And so we'll be touching on those as well. So with that, we could open it up for some Q&A. Keep popping your questions in there since we have some time. Can't promise that we will have the answers for everything, but really excited to kind of see what people are thinking about.
Great. And I will start with Kevin Jones' question in the chat. Kevin asks, could you let us know your perspective regarding ground level distribution system, GLDS, another acronym, a new on-ground move of power lines now being evaluated in Southern California, which is billed as being able to reduce by 99% the risk of wildfires from power lines. Kevin, I will take a stab at this. I have heard of GLDS, also referred to as hybrid undergrounding, which is basically a way to extend power lines on the ground with avoiding excavation, which can be, I think, extremely costly, and it helps reduce both the cost and the environmental impacts of transmission and distribution infrastructure and sensitive environments. My understanding is that this is, as you mentioned, currently being field tested by, I think, maybe just one utility in California, and there's also some lab testing going on. There are considerations that have to do with, the insulation required on those lines when they're sitting on the ground. and I'm sure other considerations that we haven't thought of. But it does seem to be, I guess I would just say this is the type of sort of evidence-based research that it's good to see the industry doing. Ultimately, we want to find ways, solutions and technology solutions that are going to help balance affordability and reduce wildfire risk. And it seems, I'm great to see that there's some work happening on this type of solution. So thanks for raising that question. Next up, we have a question from Eleanor asking about HB 3917. I heard engaging with the community on this bill, not clear whether folks are in support or opposed. And for this one, Ali, I might kick it over to you since you are the one engaging most directly with this.
Yeah, thank you, Eleanor. So this is the Oregon Utility Wildfire Fund bill. And we are currently Northwest Energy Coalition. We have taken an opposed stance. There is a public hearing next week. Mostly the reason for this stance is within the bill, it has a 3% increase across all rate classes that the Public Utility Commission can authorize. We think that that's a significant rate increase. And though this bill can, again, when we talk about the stability of utilities and making sure that they stay insured and things like that, though it has those features and it's able to have a claims process for folks who, property was damaged for wildfires or had non-economic damages, there just still isn't that balance between the customer and like the fire survivor protections within these bills as well. One thing that we are advocating for is if legislators are taking into consideration this wildfire fund bill, then they really should also be passing energy assistance and energy affordability bills as well and other customer protections. So there's obviously nuance. We're not like liability experts and things like that. But we do believe that there needs to be more of a balance in regards to the bills that are brought forward, and ensure that a claims process is accessible to all fire survivors, not just ones that may be like well-resourced, since making these claims is going to be a burden on the actual like injured party themselves. So I hope that that answered your question, and I'm always happy to talk more about that as well, and Eleanor.
All right. Thanks for that, Ali. Next question is from Julian Santos. Which utilities in Washington have the greatest wildfire risk exposure, particularly in terms of number of customers potentially impacted? I'm going to take a stab at this one, just based on not a data-driven answer, but just based on what we know about utilities in the state. I would say the greatest risk tends to be in rural areas, most of which in Washington tend to be served by public power utilities. We do have in Eastern Washington, we also have a Vista, which has a relatively rural service area, as well as in Southern Washington, Pacific Power also serves largely rural areas. And I think that, if you were to do the sort of overlay between what the insurance industry says are the high risk areas and the places that these are experiencing the most impacts and communities are experiencing the most impacts, you would see that it is largely in rural areas where, which tend to not be high population areas. But it's not, I would say that these risks are not isolated to customers in rural areas. We've certainly seen in recent years, for example, what happened in Los Angeles is not an isolated incident. We could certainly start to see more wildfires, affecting folks in suburban areas that are close to that kind of wildland urban interface, and as well as, God forbid, within our cities in the Northwest. And so we think it's something that regulators really need to be thinking about broadly. Obviously, the utility industry is thinking a lot about it. This topic is coming up at nearly every single industry conference that you hear about, and we don't expect it to go away anytime soon. So I hope that was a helpful answer to your question. And I'm gonna keep moving here. Kara Saylor says, I heard this from a rate expert the other day and it intrigued me. Curious what your thoughts are. And I quote, wildfire prevention investments are an example of investments that utility is making to reduce their own risk, but also are an outcome of fossil generation. We think using securitization to cover these investments but also keeping them from ever hitting rate base is appropriate to protect public safety, but also not allow utility to profit from the negative impacts of its product. I'll just react. I think that's an interesting perspective. Certainly, carbon emissions increase the climate impacts that we're experiencing, including wildfires, droughts, changes to the hydropower system. I think securitization has a lot of merit from a risk perspective. If you're looking at, how can we sort of prudently make sure that we're addressing the needs of both the utility and customers over time, but not creating a perverse incentive for things that ultimately, at the end of the day, we do think the utility sort of bears the obligation to maintain, safe and affordable energy, even as this risk is increasing. So I think, for us, securitization seems like a good tool, but we definitely want to be, mindful of how we're using it, as we are in an environment where the risks associated with utility infrastructure appear to be increasing and are going to continue to increase. I think, I'm not going to disagree with this statement, but I do think it's just one example of the way in which climate change is increasing risk across the board. And we really need to, I think, be mindful about how do we strike a balance in the public interest. So thanks for that, Kara. Okay, next question. Please clarify your position on Oregon legislation HB 3666.
Yeah, and I can take that one, Lauren.
Okay, thanks, Ellie.
Yeah, so that's the utility safety certificate, starting the application process in the Public Utility Commission, both for investor-owned utilities and for consumer-owned utilities. We have not taken a position. We are glad that language around utilities acting reasonably and pointing to kind of prudency in their actions, that language was removed from this bill in case that safety certificates are used in legal cases. And so that has been removed, and that's not the intent behind this bill. This is a bill that actually my representative, Pam Marsh, is in support of. So with that being removed, I think overall, since we're not engaging too much on that, just in regards to utility wildfire bills, we would just like to see more considerations within those bills for customer protections, for more investments in clean energy, meeting the targets that they're supposed to for HB 2021, energy affordability, things like that. That this bill it's very small bill, and we don't think it'll have like detrimental impacts. But we also just again don't really see that balance with customer protections and well-being within that bill. So that's I don't know if there's anything else that Lauren you want to add to that, but that's
No,
that
I,
was
I think I would just add, not everything that we've talked about today, our position isn't that all of these things need to be spelled out in every single bill in order for us to support it, right? But what we want to see is holistic consideration of all of these things through implementation, both in the plans and in the legislature. And so in some cases where we're not taking a strong, supportive or opposed position on bills. We're simply talking to folks about, well, here's some other things that you need to consider. How are these factors being considered in the regulator's review of the plans? How are these things being considered in utility investments? And so I think this is another example where it's like this bill could be a step in the right direction, but ultimately we want to see like the whole package of things that are on the table. So I hope that helps. Um, okay, next question is from Tony Usabelli. How do utility wildfire mitigation plans and activities fit with mandatory reliability standards from NERC, et cetera? Oh, this is a tough one. I'll have to say, Tony, maybe you could tell us, but but I do see these things being considered somewhat in a silo. The federal reliability standards are still kind of an umbrella, federal jurisdiction. Utilities obviously have to comply with those and submit things, to NERC and FERC in order to demonstrate that they're meeting those requirements. Um, I certainly see a link between investments that are going to improve and enhance reliability and investments that are going to reduce wildfire risk on the system. There's certainly a relationship there. But at the end of the day, I do think that wildfire risk is being treated as a somewhat unique risk in our region, and something that we do want the state regulators and the states themselves to take a close look at, which they, wouldn't necessarily do if this were something that were like under the jurisdiction of NERC and or FERC. So Tony, that's my perspective. I hope that helped address your question. If not, happy to answer a follow-up via email. All right, next question is from Maya. I have heard that for public utility districts and consumer-owned utilities, there's now only company that they can purchase insurance from in the entire country left. I'm assuming that's one company. The other company recently filed for bankruptcy. What are your thoughts on what could happen if or when PUDs and consumer-owned utilities can no longer be insured for wildfire costs? Well, thanks for bringing this up, Maya. This is very real, and this is definitely happening. Personally, I myself recently got notified by my homeowner's insurance that they were not going to renew it. So I had to go shopping for new homeowner's insurance due to wildfire risks. So I definitely see this happening in the area of the state that I live in. Ultimately, I believe we're going to need a federal program. This is the type of thing that's going to rise to the level of like flood insurance, where we're going to need a federal program that helps to spread the risk across a much broader range of individuals and companies. At the end of the day, we certainly can't expect small PUDs and consumer-owned utilities to be able to take this on, particularly if there's only one option. This is going to get extremely costly, and so I think looking at states and looking at the state and federal government to really step up in addressing wildfire risk and insurance is going to be something that over the next couple of years, I would say decade maybe, would seem to be very necessary. Okay, next question is from Rick Williams. Let's talk about reliability standards and extreme events. I'm not sure
Hi.
what the question is. Hi, Rick.
So reliability standards are an industry consensus that took about 30 years, and they exclude major storms and major events. So where we're talking about wildfires and extreme events, it's important to have the conversation about, okay, what are you including in those statistics? Do they include outages due to extreme events that can be excluded by the utilities? And it's the Pacific Northwest National Labs and the National Academies had a study that contrast reliability and resilience, and it's a big topic. And I just wondered if other people on the call have strong feelings on this as well.
Thanks for that. And I would welcome, Rick, if you want to follow up with any further information, we were happy to share it with the webinar attendees as well.
All right. Fred Hute is very familiar with this.
Yes, yes. Okay, next question is from Claire Richards. How likely is it that the federal government will help? I don't know if this was a serious question. I will say my answer to this was not meant to be political. It was really just a policy recommendation. I think, at the end of the day, we're going to need the federal government to step up. Whether or not that happens under this administration or a future administration, I don't know. But it certainly seems the way that things are going in much of the country as it relates to the risk and the insurance industry pulling out of communities. I think the political pressure is going to increase over time, and it's going to be, something that is experienced in a nonpartisan way. And ultimately, we're going to need, I think, the government to step in. Okay.
And I think Kara's question is probably the last one we'll take here as we're starting to wrap up.
Great. All right, Kara, there is anecdotal evidence that public power, due to smaller service territories and local linemen, manage fire better. Is there any research supporting that theory? That is a very interesting question. I would say I would agree with what you're saying here anecdotally. Just in my own experience, we have much shorter duration and much less frequent outages um, in public power than we do in investor-owned utilities. And I do think just given the local nature and the fact that many of these communities and rural areas of our region have been dealing with the wildfire risk for some time, there's perhaps, more mature communication systems, more kind of local on the ground relationships that are strong and have been in existence for a long time in order to deal with this risk. But yeah, I'd be super interested in any, actual research on that topic. I think that would be something really interesting to look into. Oh, and you're sharing an article, which we will put in the webinar notes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Karen.
All right, back to you, Ale.
Yeah, well, we're closing it out. Thanks y'all for sticking with us and attending this webinar today. I hope y'all have a really great Thursday and feel free to stay connected. Really appreciate it. Bye, everyone.